Globalization is the flow of products and services, labor and capital worldwide, that is across the borders. 1990 and 91 was actually pushing the entire government down the road in terms of the journey, and this was supposed to be one of the most bad times for India. The highest marginal tax reform was 56% and this was decreased to 40%, which is a very big change altogether. Good morning and welcome to the first session, Chapter 2, Unit 3, first semester BCom, Pre-Reforms of Indian Economy, where we are going to speak about the post-1991 strategies. This is an era of the economic reform, of the cycle that we all expected, that we all wanted in India. This is the economic reform of the 1991, and we say this year as the opening era of India's economic cycle, India's economic journey into progress and growth. Now, to the rest of the world, we had the intention of increasing India's presence in every sector possible. Post 1991, the first major step that was taken by the government of India was to move towards the private sector, give the opportunity for every private sector to participate in the economic activity. The economic reforms of 1991 brought in the LGP, lot of liberalization, globalization and privatization factors, now which entails the removal of government limitations on private individual activity. What is this liberalization exactly? How do we want to understand? How do you really go about it? It's like this. In the liberalization factor, in that time period, what exactly we did is that we started actually moving away from the concept of government and government interested companies only. We started making the private sectors get into the scenario. We liberalized all the limits and we started giving importance to the privatization, which refers to the transition of a business or industry service from public to private ownership and management, which means to say that in the privatization factor, we allowed every company to participate in the economic growth process. So that is very important for us. We are transitioning from a protective economy to an open economy. Till the year 1990, we were more concerned about only the government sector. We wanted the public sector unions alone to be developed, and we were very protective about having the growth within enclosed, that is inside a shell kind of a thing. But after 1991, we opened up the doors where we wanted every company to participate, every company to show an interest in terms of economic growth. Then, followed by this is the globalization, which is the flow of products and services, labor and capital worldwide, that is across the borders. Now, the globalization is also a very big factor. Why? Because we were getting prepared to make India become more known, become more advantageous in terms of moving their products and services across the globe. So that's why globalization is very important for us. Followed by the factors of when we are talking about the background of economic reform, in order to lessen the burden of the control regime, that is basically the license Raj which we wanted to remove, the Rajiv Gandhi administration in 1984 to 1999 undertook a number of reforms in the latter part of the 80s. So the post 80s, that is the late half of the 80s, what we were able to see that we slowly wanted to remove the licensing here and we wanted to give an opportunity to everybody. And then our Honorable Prime Minister Shri Rajiv Gandhi actually had taken the initiative to bring in a lot of reforms which actually helped India to grow. Now, what has happened here is that these included loosening licensing requirements, lowering import restrictions, implementing export incentives. And however, what happened is that the modifications that were made were rather very minor or fundamental in nature, more about easing the restrictions altogether, wherein you can see that there was a flexibility in the system. Companies can operate with their own range, with their own specifications altogether, and no need to worry about the government coming in and dictating ideologies to you. So in that way, I would always say the economic reform that India took was a very great step. It was a positive step in terms of growth. Followed by, it pushed the India's GDP over 5.5%, breaking the previous record of 5 and known as the Hindu rate of growth that stood at the preceding rate altogether. Probably you need to understand this 5.5 was just not a number. It was a superseding number altogether, because that laid the foundation for India today to say that we will be able to cross a 6.5 or even more than that altogether. So we are definitely a country which is looking in for a fantastic reform in the coming years. Now, secondly, what we are looking in, while the Indian economy appeared to be performing well in 1980s, but still there were a lot of structural problems. There were a lot of widespread vulnerabilities that we would be going to talk about because of the License Raj, because of the MRTP Act, and all those factors that we have been talking about. Plus, we would also look into the factors in terms of the trade and other policies that are coming into picture, which were actually disturbing India in terms of the growth process. So this was definitely not needed. This was not definitely looked into it as a part of the growth story. So the question now comes back to us is that even though you are ready to open up the economy, even though you are ready to liberalize your entire country, the country needs enough infrastructural support. The country needs enough push in the market through which they will be able to make some money. They will be able to grow further in terms of the growth aspect altogether. But what has happened in the last few years is that we have been able to see that with the growth of infrastructure and the necessary finance coming in position, this story has now become a reality. Now, moving further, due to the fact of imports that were nearly 2 times higher than that of the export, there was a massive trade gap. I would say a trade deficit altogether in the second half of the 80s. Because in the 80s and the late 80s, we were more of an importer rather than an exporter. We had to import many goods from different countries across the world, and that was one of the reasons why our economy was completely slowing downwards. But after the 1991, we slowly started bridging the deficit, and then that story of success is known to each one of us. What we exactly wanted is that the gap between that of import and export, if you look at the gap, the exports were lesser and the imports were higher side. So this was one of the biggest problem that I would say for India. We wanted the imports to come down and exports to go up. So what we did is that up till the early 1980s, government had wisely managed the fiscal deficit, but then it started to engage in something called as the fiscal profligacy, which means to say that they started spending too much of money in expenditure in terms of the government factors and other records and everything, which actually led to a dethroning position altogether. So in the early 1980s and 90s, what happened to India is that when we opened up the door in 1991, India was completely cash strapped. We did not have money altogether. Probably the one thing that we need to know, we need to understand very clearly here is that the reform journey that we took had to be calculated even more better so that we would have been in a better position by the year 1991. But unfortunately, India was completely cash strapped and we had to borrow money, and that was the beginning for us to rewrite the entire history. Followed by, if you look at the macroeconomic foundations, that turned very bad, and you could see that the deficit, the current account with 8.4%, and then a high inflation of almost 17%, huge foreign debt. So the 1990 and 91 was actually pushing the entire government down the road in terms of the journey. And this was supposed to be one of the most bad times for India. So our balance of payment was definitely affected. Now, what are the major reforms that we have carried out in 1991? The first thing, though we know that we have committed a mistake, but where did we start moving up? The first thing is fiscal stabilization. So what was that? The effectiveness of economic reforms depends on the achievement of fiscal stabilization, where what we need to see here is that the reforms have to be bought in within the budget, within the norms and regulations of the central government, which will make it even more stronger. So what was that we were actually trying to do is that we were trying to reduce the deficit, reduce the expenditure, and remake the entire thing. So that's where exactly we were making the system even more effective. So first thing is that we need to bring in reforms where the deficit can be reduced, the expenditure can be reduced, and the revenue can be increased. Followed by the industrial policy. This is a major thing that we need to understand. We all know that India is an industrially rich country because there are several types of industries that are available in our country. So as a result, what we did is the reform plan. There is no longer need for government to grant approval here. The new investments can be started with a single window system that we were planning at that point of time, and a significant expansion was given to the current capacity so that it was being managed better. So that's exactly where we started rebuilding the system altogether. Followed by the foreign investment. Prior to 1991, India had an extremely restrictive foreign policy. We never allowed countries from abroad to come inside and invest in India. But post 1991, we started opening up of sectors where foreign direct investment was allowed into India, and that was a massive success for our country. Why? Because if you start looking into the foreign direct investment that we are speaking about, the equity investments went as high up to 51%. A lengthy list of about 34 industries were given the priority to open up, come into India. And what happened is that the government approval was required, but the government was ready to open up the doors and give that permission for the foreign countries to set up their establishments in India. So this is the era which I would like to remind you, saying that banking sector opened up to a very great level. Why? Now you would see that post 1991, there were many private banks that were set up in India to facilitate the growth of credit. And also we see that a lot of foreign banks established their units in India. So this gives us a great push. This gives us the position that, credit system was completely manipulated given the time in order to grow and in order to pursue the various dreams and goals of this nation. Followed by the trade policy and the exchange rate system. Now, this was also very much needed for us. Why? Because during the exceptions, all raw materials, other production inputs and capital products can now be imported without restriction. So we are reducing the restriction. We are making it very, very clear that yes, this is going to be a great time for us, where we are not going to put in any more barricades. We are not going to put in any kind of factors, and we will see that we can make the restriction, we can make the imports come in factor at a greater flow altogether. Prior to 1991, RBI predetermined the entire official exchange rate in which the Indian rupee was converted in form of foreign currency. The value of rupee dropped to nearly 24% in July 1991. And in 1993, India switched to a market-based floating exchange system, and post that, India started gaining a huge value in the market. Why? Because earlier we had actually demonetized our entire thing. We had put our currency on a low peg, but once we started exporting, we started going further, we started exploring the market, and Indian currency started getting exposed to the global trade altogether. We were able to get a better rate for our exchange, for our value, for our rupee altogether. So that was one of the biggest things that we did post 1991, followed by the tax reforms. Now, if you see that the highest marginal tax reform was 56%, and this was decreased to 40%, which is a very, very big change altogether. Publicly listed companies, the income tax was lowered from 51.75% to 46%. The average amount of customs duty was decreased from 200% to only 65%, which is still a very big thing. Now look at the numbers that we are speaking all about. All those percentages mean a great value to the Indian system and to the country. Why? Because with this amount of huge taxation that we were paying, literally every Indian was cash strapped. They were completely out of liquidity. With the reduction in income tax, the cash in hand started going up and things started becoming better and better. So that's where exactly we are talking about a tax reform coming into picture. Followed by the public sector reforms, which is a very, very important thing. Government started a restricted process of disinvesting its ownership and equity in public sector, instead of going through a full privatization, keeping 51% of the equity, managing the entire growth process altogether, and that was made possible altogether. So what we started doing is that we started getting into public sector reforms, where we started disinvesting those companies which were actually not making any great profits, and we wanted this profits to come out in terms of the factors by giving it to the private organizations altogether. So we started building in a restrictive trade policy altogether, where we removed all this non-performing public sectors and gave way to privatization and equity growth altogether. Followed by the financial sector reforms. As I told you, the new private banks started coming into the sector, which gave a massive push to the entire economy, and that has made it. Now, in order to start overseeing the major players come back in terms of capital market and regulate the stock exchanges altogether, an independent statutory entity called as SEBI was created. SEBI was created in the year 1988. SEBI now stands for Securities Exchange Board of India, which controls the stock market in India as well as the other trade and derivatives market. Now, this is an independent regulator. It's a watchdog which takes care of all these kind of performs on the stock market. And what happens is that this starts regulating the entire market in terms of growth and performance altogether. Followed by the financial sector reforms, what we are talking about is that the capital market was made available for the portfolio investment, and the Indian businesses were permitted to access global capital markets by issuing shares overseas through the global depository receipts function altogether. So that was a fantastic move, which I would like to say when it comes to this business altogether. Why? Because we were able to see that the growth was completely fantastic, and we were able to see that the financial sector reform started moving up in a great way altogether. Followed by the impact of economic reforms of the 1991 on various economic parameters. That is, in 2.5 years, the inflation dropped from a peak of 17% August 1991 to 8.5. That is, we literally reduced it by 50%. Now, that's a very big success for India. Why? Because we were able to tame the inflation and bring it back into action altogether. The forex reserves also increased from 1.2 billion to $15 billion, a 15 times jump altogether in terms of success, in terms of growth rate in 1994. Just imagine, in 3 years, we broke the record and we were able to come here. Today, we are standing at a huge growth of $572 billion. Just look at it, 572 times we have moved further. And that's exactly what India's growth rate is there today. Probably if you have been going through the news, you would have also been able to see that India is tomorrow among the bright spots of the world economy. Why? Because India, China and US put together will contribute in future 50% of the world's GDP. Now that's a very, very positive news for India, because the growth is happening in a very big way. Now, the India's foreign trade policy, the GDP growth rate increased from 1.1% in 1991-92 to 4%. The fiscal deficit decreased from 8.4% in 1990-91 to 5.7%. Between these 2 years, the exports nearly started doubling altogether. So this is going to be something even more fantastic when we are going to talk about the growth rate altogether. Followed by the poverty reduction for a long term. Why? Because the growth contributes to the reduction of poverty in 2 ways. First, it's actually percolations in terms of the impact by enabling the government to raise more funds, support the sector altogether. So in order to significantly, it reduces the poverty. 2 strategies are removed. The first thing is that allowing rapid economic growth, which is very, very important. Concentrating on specialized programs to assist privileged, needy persons. So it is very, very important here. Why are we talking about this? Is that at times when we look into India, people still think that our nation is a poor nation. Let me just rewrite that. Let me just redefine it. We have now overcome poverty to such an extent that India is one among the richest and the most developed nations in the world. So government has taken more than necessary steps in order to reduce the poverty, reduce the inequality. Of course, the gaps still remember there in certain sectors, but we have gone miles ahead in terms of developing this entire strategy. On a concluding note, I would like to say that our inability to provide opportunities to young people inside the country post-reform is one of the most important things that we have been talking about. But India's urgent task, what I would like to say is that it is about finding the sustainable way of growth, and we have been trying to create new opportunities day by day. Of course, the global recession and other factors have also made it in such a way that probably we have lost work, the massive layoffs have been happening. But nevertheless, India has always been trying to find a sustainable way in terms of developing it. Though we are divided demographically because of several other social factors, but we are united by the dream that we want to grow further as one nation, as one country, and try to become the numero uno in terms of economic growth. The low rise in the rural productivity in India and is also another important issue in contrast to China, where we see the rural entrepreneurs was the main economic driver for years. Of course, yes, we believe on that, and that's probably the reason how the growth has been happening for so many years. With this, I come to the end of today's session. I hope and believe that all the factors that have been spoken through this session might be useful to you both in terms of practical and theoretical walk of life. In the upcoming session, we will be talking about the Planning Commission of India, which is a very important topic. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.